looks like it's working. So today, we talked about, last time we talked about philosophy in general. Today I want to get started, where philosophy gets started, where Western philosophy gets started, with the ancient Greeks. And, our reading, we got a picture of Socrates, right? This figure of Socrates. And we're going to have to talk a little bit about him. But I don't want you to get the idea that Socrates was the first philosopher. Certainly there were people doing philosophy well before Plato, well before Socrates. But Socrates is a very important figure in Western thought. He's so important that everybody before him, they are all sort of labeled as the Pre-Socratics. So there's this group of philosophers called the Pre-Socratics. And a lot of them don't really have much in common as far as their philosophy goes. They just historically came before Socrates. There's a lot of them. We're only going to speak about 3 today, and really just in brief. Thales, at least Aristotle claims, was the first philosopher. I'll talk a little bit about Thales. I'll talk a little bit about Heraclitus. And last but not least, we're going to say something about Parmenides. Now, what set these people apart from previous thinkers or previous endeavors? Well, before Thales, what kind of picture do we get of the world around us, right? If one of the things that philosophy is trying to do is explain the world around us, why the world is the way it is, how the world is, what is that way that the world is, right? If that's what they're trying to do, how was this question answered before Thales, and what makes him stand apart from the past? Well, in the past, before Thales, and this guy's like, you're not really sure, but something like 7th or maybe 8th century BCE, right? Long time ago, right? Before this, we get a picture of the world, at least from the Greeks. We get a picture of the world in the epic poetry of people like Homer, Hesiod. And what kind of picture of the world do we get? What explanation do we get for the world around us in the works of Homer and Hesiod? Anyone familiar with these 2 figures? Yeah, Homer, not Homer Simpson, but who's Homer? You had your hand up. What were you going to say? The gods, right, yeah. So the gods are somehow involved in the world around us, right? When the lightning is striking and there's really bad weather, why is that? It's not because of condensation and, all this stuff we get from the weatherman. Why? Why is it thundering and lightning? The gods are angry. Zeus is mad, right? Zeus is really ticked off and he's throwing down some thunderbolts at us, right? So we get a supernatural explanation for the natural world around us, right? How does this change with Thales? Well, we don't know much about Thales. Only like two sentences ever survived of Thales' writings, right? But apparently one thing that he believed in was that everything, the world, all the universe, is water. So, maybe I shouldn't put H2O up there on the board, because that's, we didn't have the table of elements back then, right? What were the 4 elements, right? We had water, air, earth, and fire, right? I could pass that chemistry quiz in a minute, right? I can memorize that table of elements, right? So he says everything's water. So we've got an explanation of the world around us in terms of something natural, not something supernatural, right? And we don't really know why Thales thought what he thought. We're not really quite sure. Why does he think everything's water? But I guess we could speculate. Aristotle speculated about why. And I think he comes up with some good reasons. Maybe you might think, well, why do you think someone would, if you've got those four to choose from, right? Fire, air, water, and earth. Why do you think water would be the best candidate for explaining all the others? That everything else is just water in different forms. What's so special about water that makes it a good candidate for that? It's refreshing. You need it to live, right? If you don't have water, you'll die. If you look at a little seed or something and you just let it sit there in the sun and get dry, what's going to happen? It'll die. It'll turn into dust, right? It needs water for life. So it's life-sustaining. That might be a reason that Thales thought it was so important. Maybe other things about water that it might lend it to be. What's that? 3 states. Right. So what do you mean by that? The water can take on like different. Right. If it gets really cold, it becomes solid. Right. If it gets really hot, it evaporates. Right. So maybe air is just it's water that's become evaporated, changed its state or something. And some, like Aristotle, he kind of speculates that, look, maybe, just look at geography. Who wins the battle when it comes to the elements? It seems like water eventually wins out, right? Look at the Grand Canyon, right? It took a long time, but water won, right? Rock didn't have a chance, right? So maybe that's it. It seems like water flows throughout the world. The world's made mostly out of water. Maybe that's what Thales was thinking, right? We're not really quite sure. But I think that the significant thing is, though, that he used a natural thing, water, to explain nature instead of trying to appeal to these supernatural causes, the gods, right? And so you might even think of him kind of as the first scientist, too. Maybe not a very sophisticated form of science, but still he's trying to use nature to explain nature. Well, when we get to Heraclitus, this is where it gets a little different. Heraclitus is quite unique, not just for the Pre-Socratics. He's actually pretty unique for Western philosophy in general. I don't think we get anything close to him in the West, probably until like Nietzsche, maybe, until like the 19th century. He's almost Eastern in the way that he thinks about the universe around him. According to Heraclitus, the universe operates according to a logos, is the word that he uses. The Greek word logos. And this word logos, it has quite a history to it. It'll pop up again when we get to Plato and his metaphysics. It also shows up in the New Testament of the Bible, right? In the book of Mark, I think, or maybe it's John. Which the one that starts, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God? I think it's John. I could be wrong. I think it's John. So the Gospel of John, the very beginning, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The word that gets translated as word, logos. So logos is the Greek word for word. It also has a lot more connotations than that, though. It's almost like when we use it's kind of slangish, but you might say, hey, what's the word on the street? Or, hey, what's the word today? What are we talking about? We're not asking for a particular word. It's not like Pee-wee's Playhouse. Today's secret word is... It's kind of a dated example, but... It's, what do we mean when we ask what's the word on the street? What are we asking for? What's going on? Yeah, what's happening here, right? And so for Heraclitus, I think that's kind of the connotation we have with him, is the way the things are. There is a certain way, there's a logos to what's going on, and we can give an account of it, right? But when we get to Plato, I think, it's better to think of it as a rational account. For Heraclitus, I think it'd be better to think of it as sort of the way of the universe. Is anyone in here familiar at all with Taoism? It's an Eastern philosophy of Taoism, sometimes spelled with D. Right? You hear about the Tao, right? Even you know what I'm talking about. What's that? Well, yeah, you got, okay, good, yin-yang. I'm glad you mentioned the yin-yang. That's going to come up in a minute here. Right? You've got this really bad drawing of the yin-yang symbol. I can do better than that. Let's see. That's really crappy, too. That's even worse than the first one. Oh, God, that's just pathetic. I think the yin is taking over the yang. The yang is going to flatten like a pancake, right? But opposites, right? And Heraclitus believed that, right? But the word Tao, the Tao itself, it usually doesn't get translated. So when you read the Tao Te Ching, you'll hear about the Tao. The Tao is this. You know the Tao. But sometimes they do translate it as the way, right? There's a certain way that the universe flows. And usually in Taoism, if you read the early stuff, they use water as a metaphor a lot. It's like a river that's flowing. And if you try to swim upstream, right, if you try to swim against the river, right, I don't care how powerful you are, who's going to win, you or the river? The river's going to win, right? So there's this way of the universe, and a lot of times we try to challenge that way. We try to go against it. I guess the Taoist sage has to be able to balance everything and kind of flow with the river and flow with the way of the universe. And I think, Heraclitus seemed to think the same thing about the logos, right? That there's this way of the universe. Because of our ignorance, we try to sort of stop it or go against it, but eventually the way or the logos wins out. And the logos, for Heraclitus, is held together by these two forces of strife on the one hand and flux. So strife or conflict, right? And flux, this is a part of the way of the universe, and it's what holds the universe together and makes it be the way that it is. What do I mean by flux? So strife is conflict, but flux? What's that? No, not necessarily. In fact, this is what makes it a little disorderly. Strife holds together things, but flux, or fluctuation, it's changing. It's always changing. It's always in constant flux. So, there is a logos to the universe. There is a way to the universe, but it's always moving. It's always changing, just like the river is always flowing. Heraclitus, I think this is a really bad translation, but he gets quoted as saying, you never step in the same river twice. You might have heard that expression before, right? Why don't you ever step in the same river twice? It's always moving. It's always a different river. The waters that make it up are always going to be different, flowing in and out, stuff like this, and that's the way the universe is, right? What makes a river, though, as opposed to any other body of water? What designates it as a river? It's got a certain direction, but what guides it? The land, right? So it has these two banks, right, that are sort of opposing each other. They're in opposition. They're in strife that sort of hold together as a river, but yet all the parts it's composed of, the water, is always flowing and always changing, right? It's almost paradoxical in a sense. And so Heraclitus is a bit messy, right? His picture of the universe is a bit disorderly, right? For him, no one can really understand the logos except for the philosopher. They understand the way, but even for him, it's not something that you can really articulate. You can't really put it into words. It's something you just get, you just understand, right? But you need strife, and this is something I think that really, another thing that sets him apart from the philosophers of the West, is that he embraces this strife. He says this is the way of the world. We need opposition. We need injustice to have justice. We have to have evil in order for there to be good, right? And so now we get back to the yin and the yang, right, of the Taoist, right? These opposites complement one another. If you do away with one, you also do away with the other, right? And Heraclitus, he quotes Homer from the Iliad. There's a scene where Achilles, Achilles, the warrior, right? Achilles he's really kind of, he's bummed out because his friend just got killed in battle. Patroclus just dies. And Achilles says, why do we have to fight? Why do men have to be in conflict? Why can't we just all get along, right? The Rodney King, right? Why can't we get along, man? And Heraclitus says, Achilles doesn't know how naive he's being, right? If there was no strife, if there was no conflict, there would be nothing, right? There has to be this inherent tension in the universe for everything to be sort of held together, just like the river banks hold together the river, right? So enough of that Heraclitus, a very interesting character, very different, I think, for the West. But what about Parmenides? So he's also looking at the universe around him and trying to explain things, right? Well, what is the nature of this universe? doesn't like Heraclitus' answer at all, particularly because of this idea that everything's changing all the time. Parmenides seems to think that change is somehow contradictory. You know, if I say that things change and they're different, it doesn't really make much logical sense for Parmenides, right? You know, if I say that Helen of Troy is beautiful, right? And then maybe like 10 years later, I say Helen of Troy is not beautiful, okay? Well, those two sentences seem to be contradictory. They can't both be true, can they? Helen of Troy is beautiful. Helen of Troy is not beautiful. So either one has got to be true, right? But they both can't be true. Well, is Helen of Troy beautiful? Who's Helen of Troy? Maybe she didn't really ever exist, but let's assume she did. Was she beautiful? She was supposed to be the most beautiful woman in all the Helens, right? They named the whole region after her because she was so, hot. But started the whole war and everything, right? It was all over Helen, apparently. So she was beautiful. Is she beautiful now? No, she's dust, right? So it seems like, things are changing, and so what's true about Helen of Troy isn't always true about Helen of Troy. And the same is true about a lot of things, right? Travis is young and handsome. This is true now, but 15, 20 years, Travis is old and handsome, right? This is sad fact of life, but things change, right? And for Parmenides, that was contradictory, right? You're both saying that I am and I'm not, right? That they both can't be true. So what was his solution to this? Kind of a wacky one. For Parmenides, change is just an illusion. We think that things are changing, and we think that we're getting older, but this is all an illusion because we just have such a limited view of the world, and so we can't help but see things in that way. But in reality, not only are things not changing, but, he says, we're all the same. That, it may seem to you like you're different from the things around you, that you're distinct, right? Like, I'm not this desk, it's a different thing from me, right? Well, for Parmenides, that's an illusion as well, right? For Parmenides, there is only the one. Okay, that's what he talks about a lot, is the one. All reality is one. Separation, distinction, is just illusory. It's just an illusion. All we need to speak of is the one. This view is known as monism. Right? This is a metaphysical view of the universe. If I think the universe can be reduced to one underlying substance or one thing, that's monism. As opposed to, dualism. I guess if you're a dualist, you believe, like Plato was a dualist. Plato believed that there's the world of physical things, and then there's this intelligible realm, and they're two separate realms. That's a dualistic picture. But not for Parmenides, right? For Parmenides, there's only the one. And I don't really want to get into the details of his argument. He does provide an argument for this, but it's kind of confusing. It has a lot to do with nothing, he says. You can't talk about nothing because it doesn't exist. So there's got to be some, I don't want to get into the details because it'll probably confuse you more than anything else. But just take it from me. He claims that the universe is all one, and really I think it's because, for him, that's the only rational answer. So it's almost like, because logic tells me this, because reason tells me this, it has to be true, right? He's almost extremely rational, almost absurdly rational, in a sense, if that makes sense at all. So here we have our pre-Socratic philosophers. That's really all the only details I wanted to give you about them. But there's also another group of people who we need to know about before we jump into the apology, right? And they're the Sophists, or the Sophists, however you like to pronounce it. I've heard both, so I think both acceptable, right? But the Sophists, who are they? They were these group of men who would go around ancient Greece, and they would teach people the art of rhetoric. So people would pay a lot of money also to learn the art of rhetoric. So they had very rich clients who could afford these lessons. Why the is rhetoric? Anybody have a clue what that word means? If you learn rhetoric, what are you learning? Yeah, how to speak persuasively, I guess, or how to use certain styles of speech. So why would you spend a lot of money learning how to speak persuasively or stylistically? What's the advantage of that? Fool people, I like that. Yeah, you can convince people to believe what you want them to believe. Right? You might even get some social status out of it. Hey, you sound pretty smart. You must be upper class or something. Maybe I should take you serious or something, right? And you might not know this, unless you knew a little bit about the Greek judicial system, is when you were accused of something like Socrates was, you didn't get a lawyer, right? You stood up in court and you gave your defense to the jury. And, let's say you're innocent and you're accused of something you didn't do, but you're kind of stupid. And you don't speak very well. You're not very articulate. What's going to happen when you go before the jury to plead your case? Good luck. Right? So these were kind of like the first lawyers, they wouldn't represent you, but they'd tell you how to represent yourself, right? And the idea really is that there really is no truth. It's not that there's some truth we're all trying to get at. You're just trying to convince people to believe what you want them to believe, right? And, this is probably about as far from Socrates as you can get. He seemed to, if anything, he believed that there was such a thing as truth, and that he had to pursue it at all costs, even if it meant his own life. The Sophists seem to think, look, truth is a relative thing, It depends on the Sophist that you're talking about, but some of them were pretty extreme in this view. If I'm standing let's say we got two guys standing outside and a gust of wind comes by. One of the guys says, that was really hot. That was a hot gust of wind. It was very warm. The other one says, no, that was cold. For some of the Sophists, the wind was neither hot nor cold. It was warm to one guy, it was cold to the other. And that's just how truth is. There is no truth. There's just your own subjective point of view. There is no objective truth, right? This view is known as relativism. So, there's different forms of relativism. That one that I just gave you seems to be a much more extreme, it's sort of a subjectivism. Each person decides where the truth lies, right? For the one guy, the wind is warm. For the other, the wind is cold, right? And there is no truth about it. It just depends on their own point of view, their own subjective point of view. That's subjectivism. You might have actually heard of cultural relativism. I hear this term trotted out a lot in politics, right? Especially a lot of the real social conservatives are like, oh, our society is being corrupted by cultural relativism, right? And this is the idea that, yeah, there really are no truths about things, but truth is something that's culturally relative. So you believe what your culture believes. You tend to believe the things that your culture, the culture you're raised in, believes. And so really there's no underlying truth to the matter. Well, Socrates, obviously, he doesn't claim to know a whole lot, but he does know this. He seems to think that, yes, there are some things that are true. They're just true. They don't depend on the person. They don't depend on the culture. There are absolute truths, and we've got to try to find out what they are. That is the job of the philosopher. So who the heck is this guy, Socrates? Very important figure in philosophy, and it's quite staggering that he is when you really think about his origins. The guy was not upper class at all, right? He was a citizen, right? He wasn't a slave, but he was basically right above slavery, right? He was not one of the upper class Athenians. He wasn't aristocratic at all. He had fought in the war against the Peloponnese. So he was in the Peloponnesian War. Seemed to be a very patriotic Athenian, at least if we take him at his word. But what exactly his word was, that's something that's debatable, because he never wrote anything, right? Socrates didn't leave any writings. All we have about him we get through Plato. There's also some things that Xenophon says about Socrates. Xenophon was a historian, and they both lived at the same time that Socrates lived, so I guess they're fairly reliable. And there's also a guy named Aristophanes who wrote plays. He wrote tragedies and comedies, and he wrote a play called The Clouds, where he really makes fun of Socrates. He characterizes Socrates as a kind of a bumbling buffoon who has his head in the clouds. He even calls Socrates a sophist. I don't know if he did that because he knew it would piss off Socrates, or if he just didn't know any better, and he actually confused himself and thought Socrates was a sophist. No one's really quite sure what was going on there. But as you'll see in this dialogue, Socrates doesn't mention the sophist by name, but some of the things that he says, they're very antithetical to this sophistic approach, right? Especially right at the beginning of the dialogue. We'll see when we get to it, right? So we've really got quite a challenge here if we want to get at historical Socrates, right? Because when Plato wrote about Socrates, it was always in a dialogue. And, we think that the Apology is probably the closest thing to an historical document. It was written fairly close to the trial, and a lot of people would have been around, and they would have known whether or not Plato was just, pulling our leg or not. But when we get to the later dialogues, it's really difficult to tell who's the real Socrates, and when Plato might just be using Socrates as his spokesperson, right, or just as a literary device. I mean, this is an intro course, so I guess we shouldn't dwell on it too much, but I should at least let you know, right, that it seems like, pretty much everybody, I think, if they've read enough Plato, they're going to have their own version, their own idea of who Socrates really was, right, what Plato was doing, right, so. Okay, well, let's go ahead and get to this dialogue. Let's read here the very first passage where Socrates makes this distinction between different types of speaking, right? Different types of speech. So let's read here. I'll read slow for those of you who have yet to get the text. Let's see. That's psychology, not philosophy. Do they tell you to get that book at the bookstore? They probably misheard you or something like that. I don't know. The book actually is just optional. You don't have to get it. The readings are all available on the Eagle website, or the Angel website. So yeah. So go. I said Eagle because that's the one at HCC, right? We got Blackboard at San Jack. We got Angel here, and we've got Eagle at HCC. So it's confusing for me. But, all the readings are available online, and the Apology begins like this, right, this very beginning. I do not know, men of Athens, how my accusers affected you. As for me, I was almost carried away in spite of myself. So persuasively did they speak. And yet hardly anything of what they said is true. Of the many lies they told, one in particular surprised me. Namely, that you should be careful not to be deceived by an accomplished speaker like me. That they were not ashamed to be immediately proven wrong by the facts, when I show myself not to be an accomplished speaker at all. That, I thought, was most shameless on their part. Unless indeed they call an accomplished speaker the man who speaks the truth. If they mean that, I would agree that I am an orator, but not after their manner. For indeed, as I say, practically nothing they said was true. So what's he doing here at the beginning? He's distinguishing between two ways of speaking. Speaking the truth and speaking, orator, speaking persuasively, right? So there's a difference, right? One can be very persuasive, but you're trying to sort of feed somebody a load of crap, right? It may sound great, but it's a lie, okay? Socrates says, that's not me, right? I am not that good at persuading. But if you're talking about speaking the truth, then certainly that's what I do. I speak the truth, right? So obviously he hasn't mentioned the Sophists, but that's certainly who Socrates got in mind, right? What do they teach? They teach you how to speak persuasively. Are they concerned with what the truth is? No. They're concerned with you being able to persuade the others what you want them to believe in order to get whatever you want, right? Something to your advantage. Okay? Well, once we start getting into this dialogue here, we get Socrates' defense to the jury. Why is he here? What has he been accused of? What is Socrates doing here in court? Questioning the wisdom of men, I think that's his version. I think that's I'm here because I questioned your wisdom and you got mad at me, and now I'm here. That's kind of his version. But what are the official charges? What are they saying? Corrupting the youth is one of them, yeah, for sure. What about the gods? Worshipping other gods or teaching of new gods or something. It gets not believing. He gets accused of all sorts of stuff, right? But it kind of boils down to corrupting the youth. And I think I should just use the word impiety, not being pious. Right? What does that mean? Piety or impiety, the opposite. To be pious, what is that? Anybody? Disrespect towards the God. Yeah, impiety is disrespect towards the God. Or really, I guess, generally, piety doesn't have to be towards the gods, but it's sort of being religiously observant, right? Respecting religious institutions, and certainly that would include respecting the gods. So he's not respecting the gods of the city. He's teaching of new spiritual things. Later in the dialogue, he gets Miletus to even say he doesn't even believe in the gods, right? That's kind of contradictory. We'll see that in a minute. So here are the charges that he has to deal with, right? And I don't want to give you the idea that, I think that if you just read Plato, you tend to sympathize more with Socrates. Some people don't. I know some people that just can't stand him and think he's a smartass, right? But a lot of times, he comes off pretty good. Like, he's a noble guy and he's doing the right thing. And maybe, just jumping into the apology is not quite fair. It kind of loads, it sort of gives him too much of an advantage. You don't really see Socrates in action. You kind of do towards the middle when he's cross-examining Miletus. But, here's a guy, Socrates, who he's not really well off, okay? Doesn't make a lot of money. He's got a family, got a wife and kids, but he doesn't really work. He just walks around Athens questioning people, That's all he goes. Imagine you're a bricklayer or you're a blacksmith. You're in your workshop trying to do your job. You're over there. You're sweating and you're pounding on that metal to make the shield or whatever it is. And here comes this bumbling buffoon. At least that's how Aristophanes sees him. This guy who's probably not very well dressed. He's probably not very clean either. And he himself claims that he's pretty ugly. And the guy shows up. Hey man, I know you're busy right now, but I really want to know what justice is. Could you tell me what justice is? Surely justice is more important than that shield that you're working on. Oh, geez, I guess it is, Socrates. Well, okay, justice is being fair. Okay, well, what does it mean to be fair? Well, giving people their just due. Well, you just used the word justice to define justice. You said giving people their just due, and we're trying to define justice, so you can't do that. Okay, justice is giving everyone their equal share. Okay, well, how do you determine an equal share? And maybe some people don't deserve an equal share. Some people work harder. They deserve. So every definition you give the guy, he pokes holes in, and he just tears it apart, right? How are you going to react eventually? Right. Yeah. You might get violence. You might just tell him to go away. Right. You might be like Euthyphro. Euthyphro in an earlier dialogue. This happens a lot. Euthyphro just runs off. Just leave me alone. I'm going to run away. I don't care what piety is. That's what Socrates asked Euthyphro. What is it to be pious? And he's not happy with the answers that he gets. So you get frustrated. You might get violence. You might just run away. Or you might try to turn the tables on Socrates, right? What could you do? ask him, well, you don't like my definition of justice. You seem to know a lot about it. Why don't you tell me what justice is, right? Well, what kind of answer is he going to give you? I don't know. I don't know what it is. That's why I'm asking you, right? And so again, I can see why he might be kind of frustrating and annoying to some of the Athenians. Okay, so there's Socrates for you. But what does he do here first? He says, look, these charges are false. Impiety, corruption, these are false charges. But why? Why are they false charges? Well, he's got a reputation, and he acknowledges this. I've got a reputation among the Athenians. They don't like me. I'm annoying you guys. But here's why I have this reputation. What caused it was a sort of a certain kind of wisdom. He heard something about himself that made him go on this quest, right? To start asking questions. What did he hear about himself? Right. There are none wiser than Socrates. Right. There are none wiser than Socrates. This is what he hears. What is his name? Cheraphone or Sheraphone goes to visit the oracle. Right. So the oracle. What's the oracle? Anybody? Delphi. Yeah, the oracle at Delphi. Right. So apparently, they believe that if you go to this temple at Delphi, you could go see the oracle, right? And the oracle supposedly was speaking for Apollo. The god Apollo, would just come down and speak. So I can't spell his name. Apollo would speak through the oracle. So whatever the oracle said was pretty much taken as fact, right? The god said it. The god wouldn't lie. So if the god says there are none wiser than Socrates, well, there must be none wiser than Socrates. But wait a minute, though. Socrates doesn't seem to think that this is literally true, right? I mean, the oracle sometimes speaks in riddles, and this must be one of those times, because, well, how does he react when he finds this out? When Socrates hears there's none wiser than Socrates, is he like happy and, oh yeah, I'm pretty smart. These people are idiots and I'm wiser. Is that how he reacts, or what? He disbelieves it. Why? Why doesn't he believe that he's the wisest? What's wrong with that? I couldn't be the wisest. Why not? What does he know?
Because he thinks he knows better.
Right, he's like, I don't know anything. I have no knowledge. I wish I had knowledge. I wish I knew what justice was. I wish I knew what the good was. But I don't. I don't have knowledge. So the oracle must mean something when the oracle says that I'm the wisest. I've got to figure out what the oracle means. So how does he do this? How does he set out to investigate? I've got to find somebody wiser. So I've got to go to those who have this reputation for wisdom, right? The wise men. And what happens in his quest? Let's read here. What is this on page? Page 22. I like Plato. At least the way they usually do it. It's easy to follow, even if you don't have the same edition as me. They usually have these numbers in the margins, right? I forgot the name. There's a technical name for the numbering system here. But it's about, 21b in the margins. So that's like page 23. Actually, this is wrong. Backing up a bit. Let's see. We're beginning with uses. Okay, yeah, 21b, I was right. I was looking at 20b. That's where I was off. Yeah, 21b. This is on page 24 if you have the handout online. Socrates says, look, consider that I tell you this because I would inform you about the origin of the slander. Why do I have this bad reputation? When I heard of this reply, when I heard that the oracle said I was the wisest, I asked myself, whatever does the god mean? What is his riddle? I'm very conscious that I am not wise at all. What then does he mean by saying that I am the wisest? For surely he does not lie. It's not legitimate for him to do so. For a long time I was at a loss as to his meaning, and then I very reluctantly turned to some such investigation as this. I went to one of those reputed wise wiser than I. But you said that I was. Then when I examined this man, there's no need for me to tell you who he was. My experience was something like this. I thought that he appeared wise to many people, and especially to himself, but he was not. I then tried to show him that he thought himself wise, but that he wasn't, and as a result, he came to dislike me. And so did many of the bystanders. So I withdrew and I thought to myself, I am wiser than this man. It's likely that neither of us knows anything worthwhile, but he thinks that he knows something when he does not. Whereas when I do not know, neither do I think that I know. So I'm likely to be wiser than he is, at least to that small extent, that I do not think I know what I do not know. After this, I approached another man, one of those thought to be even wiser than he, and I thought the same thing. And so I came to be disliked both by him and by many others. So he seems to be talking about the politicians, right? Our public men, as he puts it, right? What is his experience of them, right? So that's his first, those are his first victims, I guess, if you will, right? What's the problem here? They have the appearance of wisdom, just like the sophist might give you an argument that appears to be good because it's so persuasive, but it really has nothing to do with the truth. Same thing with politicians, right? They appear to have wisdom, but what's wrong? Do they? No, and what's really worse is they think they do have knowledge, right? That's, I think, the real flaw. So how is Socrates better? Right, he knows that he doesn't know, right? That's almost like a contradiction or paradox. But yeah, he knows at least the limit of his knowledge, right? He knows, and he doesn't claim to have knowledge when he doesn't, right? Whereas they're just willing to say whatever to appear wise, right? Who does he go to next? Right, poets are the next on the chopping block, right? And let's see how he deals with them. Let's read here. I'm going to skip a bit here. That's kind of towards the middle of the page there where I left off, 22b, about one line up. After the politicians, I went to the poets, the writers of tragedies and dithyrambs and other dithyrambs. That's like a folk song to Dionysus or something. So I went to them intending in their case to catch myself being more ignorant than they were. So I took up those poems with which they seemed to have taken the most trouble, and I asked them what they meant, in order that I might at the same time learn something from them. I'm ashamed to tell you the truth, gentlemen, that I must. Almost all the bystanders might have explained the poems better than their authors could. I soon realized that poets do not compose their poems with wisdom, but by some inborn talent, by inspiration, like seers and prophets who also say many fine things without having any understanding of what they say. The poets seem to me to have had a similar experience. At the same time, I saw that because of their poetry, they thought themselves very wise in other respects, which they were not. So there again, I withdrew thinking that I had the same advantage over them that I had over the politicians. So we've got these poets who write some pretty wise things. I mean, Socrates seems to think, look, I learned from their poems, but when I went to go talk to the poets, what happened? What's that?
They seem not to understand themselves.
They don't even really know what they're saying themselves, right? And even the people standing by seem to get their poetry better than they did. So he concludes what? That they don't compose their poetry with knowledge, but with what? They're just talented, they're inspired, right? They don't really have any understanding of what they're saying. So apparently for Socrates, if I'm going to have knowledge, which they don't have, I also have to have understanding. They lack understanding, right? They're doing it, they're just saying stuff without really understanding what they're saying, and it may have some truth to it, and you might learn from it. But their problem is, too, because they're able to do this, they think very highly of themselves, right? Oh, I'm pretty smart, aren't I? But that's their flaw, right? Same flaw as the politicians, right? To think they have knowledge when they don't. And at least Socrates is willing to admit when he doesn't have knowledge, right? So pretty much same problem with the politicians. In a way, I want to come to the defense of the poets here. I think Plato and Socrates both seem to be very suspicious of artists in general, poets and tragedians and things like this. We'll see why exactly when we get to Plato's metaphysics. There's a metaphysical reason why he's suspicious of art in general, right? The Greeks, they thought of art as a form of mimesis. The word mimesis is to imitate or to mimic, right? The word mimic comes from that, mimesis. And so they see art as a sort of imitation of life. The expression, art imitates life. Well, for Plato, he wants to get at the truth of the matter. For Socrates, you want to get at truth. We don't want an imitation. So if art is an imitation, it's further removed from that real reality, so we want to avoid it, right? But again, I kind of want to come to the defense of the poets and the artists, and maybe this is my own modern perspective creeping in here, and maybe this is a little out of place in ancient Greek mind frame, in the ancient Greek mind frame. But sometimes you might, let's think of like a modern day example of a poet, right? Poetry is not that popular as it was back then. Music, I guess. Let's think of an artist who's very popular in music, and not just some pop star, but somebody who's an actual songwriter who writes, metaphorical things and stuff like this, right? Oftentimes, if you hear them in an interview being asked to explain the meaning of one of their songs, right? Sometimes you get a very straightforward answer. Right? Oh, well, I was inspired by the death of my friend, and it's about dealing with that. Or, this is about a trip I took to the beach, and it's a fun song. They have a story behind it, and they're willing to explain it. But that's not always the case, right? Sometimes, especially if you're really into, like, art, visual art, listen to an interview with Andy Warhol, right? Go on YouTube and look up Andy Warhol interview, right? You never get a straight answer from that guy, right? He'll answer the question that you didn't even ask, right? Just to confuse the heck out of you. It's almost like he had it planned ahead, like the interview that he wanted to give, and I don't care what you're asking, here's what I'm telling you, right? So sometimes you get, hey, Andy Warhol, or I'm trying to think of a Pollock, Jackson Pollock. What does your painting mean? What are you trying to convey here? What sort of answer might you get from an artist? Well, you might not get an answer at all, right? You might get something like this. It's open to interpretation. And you're laughing, but maybe that's a legitimate reply. Maybe it's like, hey, I was creating this song. Maybe Socrates, right? I was inspired. I had a feeling, and it means something to me. But if you get something out of it that's completely different, that's fine. That's legitimate, right? I mean, I was just putting this out as a piece of art. It's a piece of work. It's up to you, right? I mean, there's a philosopher, Derrida, who makes this point, that once I create something, it's no longer mine. Once I put it out there in the world, right, I hope that you're going to receive it in the way that I want you to receive it, but there's no guarantee. You might take it completely the opposite way, and this is the way art is, right? But again, maybe I'm a little too modern when I'm defending the poets here, but I do think that Socrates and Plato seem to have quite a bias against them, so I just kind of want to be fair to the poets. But who's the last group that we get to pick on? The craftsmen, right? Or the artisans, depending on which translation you have. The craftsmen. And I think he's probably the lightest on them. They're still flawed. They're not as wise as him for that same reason, but they do seem to teach him something, right? He does learn something from the craftsmen, right? Finally, I went to the craftsmen, for I was conscious of knowing practically nothing. And I knew that I would find that they had knowledge of many fine things. And in this I was not mistaken. They knew things that I did not know, and to that extent they were wiser than I. Right? So they knew about building ships, if they were a shipbuilder. They knew about being a blacksmith. They knew all the stuff working with metal that, of course, he doesn't know. But, he says, men of Athens, the good craftsmen seem to me to have the same fault as the poets. Each of them, because of his success at his craft, thought himself very wise in many other most important pursuits. And this error of theirs overshadowed any wisdom they had. So I asked myself on behalf of the oracle whether I should prefer to be as I am, with neither their wisdom nor their ignorance, or to have both. Excuse me. The answer I gave myself in the oracle was that it was to my advantage to be as I am. So the craftsmen had knowledge of their skill or their craft or their techne, that's the Greek word. They had technical knowledge, but this led them to think that they had other types of knowledge, which they didn't have, right? It's sort of, I had his brother-in-law, I remember he still does, Linux operating system, or Linux networking system, or something like this. It's a computer networking system that you use in a lot of offices use Linux, okay? And he's a real computer nerd, right? I remember I lived in Austin with him and my sister for a while, and anytime I had a problem with my computer, I would go talk to him, and boy, that was a mistake, right? It's like, I can't seem to log on the internet, and he just starts using words that I've never heard of before, and my eyes glaze over, and I'm like, this is another language, right? And he tended to think that I was kind of stupid, he just roll his eyes, oh, you don't know what blah, blah, blah means, I'm just like, no, I don't, do you know about, Heidegger and Sartre and existentialism? Why don't you tell me about Plato, idiot, you don't know who that is, So, you get really good at a certain thing, and you sort of become arrogant. You sort of think, I'm a really good mechanic, so I ought to be the mayor of Houston, this sort of thing. So they get this arrogance about them, and they're overshadowed by this arrogance, and they think that they have knowledge when they don't. And so I think Socrates is trying to say, through his investigations, he came to know that what the oracle meant was not really that he was so wise, but that at least he knew that he wasn't wise. Right? And how does he put it here? Human wisdom is worth little or nothing, right? Divine wisdom is the key here. Let's see. Let's finish the account here, right? Right where I left off. As a result of this investigation, I acquired much unpopularity of a kind that's hard to deal with. It's a very heavy burden. Many slanders came from these people, and a reputation for wisdom. For in each case, the bystanders thought that I myself possessed the wisdom that I proved my interlocutor didn't have. So, here's that problem where you're like, well, you tell me what justice is, Socrates. You don't like our definitions, and you must know what it really means. Tell us. Well, I don't know, right? I don't know. And that's kind of going to tick them off as well, right? What is probable, gentlemen, is that in fact the God is very wise, and that his response meant that human wisdom is worth little or nothing, and that when he says this man Socrates, he's just using my name as an example, as if he said, this man among you mortals is wisest, who like Socrates understands that his wisdom is worthless. So even now I continue to investigate as the God bade me, and I go around seeking out anyone, citizen or stranger, whom I think is wise. Then if I do not think he really is wise, I come to the assistance of the God, and I show him that he's not wise. Right? So he's doing this because it's a mission from the God, right? He's doing his duty to Apollo, right? Because of this occupation, I don't have time for leisure, to engage in public affairs, to any extent, nor even to look after my own. I can't even take care of my own wife and kids because I'm so worried about investigating. But I live in great poverty because of my service to the God. So, you might be asking yourself, if this is supposed to be a defense against the charges, how exactly does that work, right? Is he really directly addressing the charges? So far, we've gotten this story of his investigations, right? Well, the reason I'm here is because, I heard I was the wisest. I wanted to figure out what that meant, and ended up pissing a lot of people off. So here I am, right? How does this work as a defense?
I think that it's jealousy.
Right. So again, I think he's trying to say, it's not really that I'm corrupting the youth or I'm being impious. I'm just making a lot of people angry. You know, if you're a politician who has a lot of power and influence in the city, and then some basically homeless guy walks up to you and shows everybody you're an idiot, you're pretty ticked off, right? You're going to lose that power and you're going to want to persecute him, right? So I guess that's one way that it's working as a defense, but I think really he kind of is directly addressing one of them. What were you going to say?
He's explaining to the church how he gets people off, and those are the people that are slandering him by using him or those things.
Right, they've got a bias against him, right? It's not that they're telling the truth. They're just saying whatever it takes to get him in trouble because he's shaking things up. But I still think also, in a sense, this account of his mission, his investigations, he is kind of directly addressing at least one of the charges, right? Remember the charge that impiety and corrupting youth, you were shaking your head, yes, you think he's addressing this? How so, though? I think you're right.
Because when he said he's working for Apollos to find out truth, that means he's believing in God.
Right. If he didn't respect the gods, if he wasn't a pious person, he wouldn't have believed the oracle. And he even starts to characterize this investigation as a kind of a divine mission. That he's on this mission from God, the god Apollo, to seek the truth, right? And to question people, and to show them that human wisdom is worth little or nothing compared to divine wisdom. Yeah, Travis. Well, I don't think he does. I don't think he admits to that, although he might be a little, I don't know, we're not really sure exactly if this is historical Socrates or not, so who knows what he really believed when it came to gods. But I think if you read a lot of Plato, if you read enough Plato, you start to realize that certainly Plato does not have the same view of the gods that your common Athenian would have. But at least on the face of it in here, he does seem to say, I believe in Apollo, I believe you got to respect the gods, etc., etc. Whether or not he's telling the truth about that, I guess that's something we could debate. But at least here in the doc, because remember, when we get to this in a minute, I don't know if we have time for today, we get to this in a minute where he talks about Miletus saying he doesn't believe in the gods, and he says that's not true. I do believe in the gods. I do. If I believe in spiritual things, I have to believe in gods. Right? Comment, question. So yes, I think in a way this account of his investigations is directly addressing at least the first charge, right, of impiety. Of course I'm pious. I'm doing this even though it causes me suffering, even though I don't have time to take care of my family and I live in poverty. Even though I know people are going to hate me, I still do it because it's what the God wanted me to do. It's what the god Apollo wanted me to do. Right? It's 11. Okay, 11:40. And what, we got till 11:50? Is that right? Okay, we'll start wrapping things up then. But yeah.
This is a little off subject.
Yeah.
Already you've said that he has wife and kids.
Right.
And you've also said that in the city he was an annoying person. How did that work out?
You mean did that happen? Did that take a toll on his family, perhaps?
So like, if he was such an annoying person to everyone,
Yeah.
how did he have a wife?
Oh, wife and kids. Yeah. That's a good question, right? That's a good question. I think, what is it? Nietzsche says something like, the philosophers should never get married. Think of any philosopher; they were all single. Socrates is the only exception. I think he did it just to prove that that's the case, that you should never get married, because he was a horrible husband and a horrible father, like that. We don't really know too much about his family, but from what I know, his wife was not very well regarded herself. I think she was a little loose. I think she might have been actually a prostitute. I think at one time. They were lower class citizens. I think that really would have, it's kind of un-PC to talk this way. But I think it's an important detail to know because, to think about the shock to the system, right? If you're a politician and you're this guy who's born to a wealthy aristocratic family and you get respect just because of that. Oh, he's rich, respect him. Oh, he must, And then here comes this vagabond, this ugly Socrates guy, and he makes you look like an idiot, that's going to make it even harder on you, right? It'd be one thing if you were refuted by somebody of your same social stature, but somebody coming from the lower classes and showing you up, that's really going to irk you, I think, even extra, right? But as far as like how he got married and how this guy convinced any woman to marry him, I don't know. I'd like to know myself. Maybe be a good formula to utilize. We've gotten a good start, though, on the apology, but we really haven't gone through the full defense yet. So I guess next week, we're off on Monday, so we've got quite a few days. We'll finish his defense, we'll finish the apology, and we'll get a good start on Credo. So if you want to write on the Credo dialogue, you need to do that by next time. You've got a long ways to go, right? Got a long weekend coming up. So any last-minute questions or concerns? Okay, well, you can just ask me after class. I guess y'all have a good weekend. I'll see you in a few days. So.